Why is spelling in English so weird? This is a question often students will ask me, but I totally understand it. You can read a word like tough, and then it makes sense that rough, which ends in the same four letters, rhymes. They both end with OUGH, and both of those two endings are pronounced as uff. But then you encounter through and thorough with the same four letters at the end, but very different sounds. And then on top of that, you have words like ghost and debt with silent letters without much logic. And then you have borrowed words which even confuse native speakers. And yes, if you're an English language learner who struggles with the spelling versus pronunciation in English, you might take heart knowing that there are many words that even often confuse native speakers. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about why English spelling is so crazy, how it can affect native speakers. I'll follow that up with a real life story about my son. And then I'm going to talk about what you can do to sort of navigate this crazy spelling in English. Hello, you wonderful people. Welcome to English Right Now. My name is Roy, your British English teacher. And on this channel, we talk about all things related to British English, pronunciation in a modern British RP accent, and of course, British culture. Now, over the years, I've been a teacher for nearly 15 years, a teacher of English for nearly 15 years, and I've helped thousands of students with questions just like this. And in this lesson, we're going to address why English spelling is so crazy and what you can do about it. And if you want to learn even more about this lesson, there is a free PDF down below. Just click on the link and you can get your free PDF to learn even more. So, what happened? How did a language that was once pretty straightforward get so bizarre? Now, I'm going to give you a brief history of why the spelling is so crazy. So, English is a Germanic language, but we need to start in 1066. That's how far we're going back. And we're talking about a gentleman called William the Conqueror. Now, before this, English, or what we refer to as Old English, was very different. And in fact, apparently, a speaker of German these days would have more chance of understanding a speaker of Old English than most modern Brits would. But as I said, in 1066, a gentleman called William the Conqueror invaded England and basically took over. He came with his Norman army, speaking a Norman dialect, which is a dialect of French. He came from a northern region of France called Normandy, and he basically took over England and changed everything in many, many different ways, including replacing the ruling elite with French speakers. Now, for a few hundred years from this point on, French was the language of anybody in power, the courts, and the entire ruling class. And with this invasion, with William the Conqueror, suddenly thousands upon thousands of French words flooded into the English vocabulary. Here's the problem. Those words that came into English kept their French spellings, and they followed completely different rules to English. And this created our first major layer of chaos. I mean, that's not to mention the fact that we have two words often related to an animal. For example, cow, which is a Germanic word, and beef, which is a French origin word, both relate to the animal. The cow is when it's alive, and beef is when it's just the meat, it's dead. Why? Well, the Norman nobles would encounter the meat when it was on the table, which is when it was dead, so they called it beef, and they were French speakers. They would use that. But the people that were working in the farms were Old English speakers, so they would refer to the animal as cow. And the problem is, we didn't really streamline English. It was a bit like Pokemon. We wanted to catch them all. We just kept adding and adding to the vocabulary. And then we also need to talk about why words like guarantee and warranty both exist in the English language. Warranty is a Norman word, so it's a word that William the Conqueror would possibly have been using, that W sound at the start. However, later on, we had another royal family called the Plantagenets, who came from a central region of France, speaking a different dialect, and the word warranty, which starts with that W sound, would be pronounced with a G sound in that region, and they added the word guarantee. But rather than getting rid of warranty and replacing it with its like-for-like word guarantee, we kept them both and gave them slight new meanings. So you get an idea that during this period of time, a lot of new words were added to the English language that really didn't follow the spelling rules or the pronunciation rules of what came before. But we can't only blame William the Conqueror and the French-speaking kings who came after him for the state of English spelling. We also need to talk about the Great Vowel Shift, and it was a series of pronunciation changes in the vowels of the English language. And it primarily took place between the 14 and 1600s, and it marks the transition period from Middle English to early modern English. Now, before this shift, a word like name, which we would say now, was pronounced something more like name, and a word like fine would be more like fin, which probably for many of you out there makes a bit more sense. But the pronunciation of almost every long vowel in the language moved. And the invention of the printing press around this time only made things worse. It essentially froze English spelling in place right in the middle of a massive phonetic change. So while everything in pronunciation was changing, the spelling was becoming standardized. So effectively, we were left with medieval spellings trying to represent modern pronunciations. And that brings us on to the third reason that English spelling is such a mess: the printing press. Now, you would think the invention of the printing press would have helped standardize everything and just clean up the mess. But in many ways, it made it worse. So the printing press was invented in the 15th century, and the man who is thought to have brought it to England was William Caxton, and he had a huge task ahead of him. English in this period of time had no official spelling rules, and dialects were basically madness. They were all over the place. There's a famous story that Caxton wrote about when a person from the north asked for eggs, referring to eggs, and a woman that this person from the north spoke to didn't understand and actually said she didn't understand French because in her dialect, that word was more like eren. So effectively, Caxton realized that he had to make some choices. But here's where things get really strange. You would imagine that most of the early printers that Caxton employed, or other people employed, would be English, but they weren't. The people they employed were often Dutch or Flemish, and they brought their own spelling habits with them. Take the word ghost. It used to be spelled G-O-S-T, but Dutch printers decided to add a silent H to the English word to make it look more familiar to Dutch speakers, which is why now we have a silent H that really doesn't make any sense. That also doesn't talk about misspellings, which would have created a lot of changes of spellings or standardizations of English words. And to make matters even worse related to the printing press, some printers were paid by the line. Now, it's rumoured that this created a kind of financial incentive to make lines, sentences, and words longer. So let's take the Old English word friend, which is much more logical in terms of spelling. It was F-R-E-N-D. But printers often stretched it out to F-R-I-E-N-D. They just threw an I in there to fill a little bit more space and to make a little bit more money, which effectively means that some of the modern spellings that possibly trip you up are absolutely insane because of greed. So sadly, the printing press didn't really create a system, kind of fossilized chaos. And sadly, the chaos doesn't end there because we need to answer the question, why is there a B in debt? Well, this is due to some scholars who effectively should have known better. In the 16th century, some linguists wanted to reform the English language and change it and make it look a bit more fancy. And English scholars became obsessed with the classical languages like Latin and Greek. And effectively, they tried to tie some words to reflect their possible Latin roots, even though those words or letters were never pronounced in English. These scholars added a B in words like debt and doubt to make it look a bit more Latin. And the sad truth is, before this, in Middle English, these words were spelt much more phonetically. Debt wasn't spelt D-E-B-T, it was spelt D-E-T-T-E. And doubt, which is now spelt D-O-U-B-T, was spelt D-O-U-T-E, borrowed straight from French. But scholars knew they ultimately came from Latin, so they just shoved a B in there as a kind of tribute. And these guys didn't stop by putting B's in words. It's the reason that island has a silent S and receipt has a silent P, confusing spellers for centuries to come. So that brief history gives you an idea of why English spelling is so weird. But now let's talk about modern English and why some words are still quite confusing. Now, every so often, a newspaper or some kind of online article will be published which talks about words which English speakers, native English speakers, struggle to spell. And quite commonly, at the top of those lists are borrowed words. And I don't know why we call them borrowed words, because we've kind of stolen them. We're not giving them back. But often we see the word broccoli. Now, broccoli is spelt B-R-O-C-C-O-L-I. Another word that we commonly see is committee, which is spelt C-O-M-M-I-T-T-E. double E. But why are these words so complicated? Well, first of all, just because there are double letters doesn't make the sound longer. Now, if you say broccoli in Italian, that double C elongates, but in English, it doesn't really make a difference whether there is one C or two C's in that word. It's still going to be the same length because in English, the consonant length is not distinctive within root words. Now, gemination, which is the elongating of consonant sounds, does exist, but it's marginally, often across syllable breaks. So effectively, a word like broccoli could be spelt with two C's and one L. It could be spelt with one C, two L's. It could be spelt with two C's, two L's, one C, one L. It could be spelt with a Y on the end, and the pronunciation would be exactly the same in English. Likewise, a word like committee could be spelt with one M, one T, one E, or a variety of it. It could be spelt with a K at the start. And that's not to mention the vowels. In a weak, unstressed syllable, often any vowel can be replaced by the schwa, which makes it really, really confusing as to how to pronounce, or actually how to spell the word if you can't hear which vowel is being pronounced. And going back to broccoli, some people will pronounce it with two syllables as broccoli, which brings even more spelling options, and it can even be spelt like a place in the UK, which is broccoli, which is Brocckley, has the same pronunciation as some people will say for the vegetable. And that is the first reason that a lot of these borrowed words are completely misspelt by English people. But then there are other mistakes that native speakers make. I'm not talking about learners of English, although quite often I get asked these questions. The pronunciations of there, T-H-E-R-E, which relates to a location. I live over there. Their, T-H-E-I-R, which is the possessive, their books, and the contracted version of they are, T-H-E-Y-R-E, are all pronounced the same. There. Likewise with words like your, which is the contracted version of you are, and your, the possessive pronoun. And that's not even talking about the fact that names and place names in the UK don't make much sense. And one common mistake I keep seeing English speakers, native English speakers, making these days is writing would and the second word OF, would've. Because would've also sounds like the correct form would have when we're speaking at natural speed. I would have done that. So people are mistaking the word have for of. So what is the problem with English? Well, when I learned English, when I was studying in school as a child, they tended to use rote learning. Now, rote learning is a memorization technique based on repetition. You would see how a word was spelt, you would practice it over and over again, and eventually you would get it right. These days, a lot of kids are taught phonics. They're told about certain letters being certain sounds. But the problem is, English is not a phonemic language, and it gets pretty tricky, especially where the schwa can replace any vowel, and R's are often silent in modern British RP. So how can you teach a child that the R in park is silent? I've heard my son sounding out the word saying p-a-r-k, park, but not pronouncing the R when he says it. As I said, English is not a phonemic language, and you cannot trust the spelling. But this brings me on to a personal story. My son was reading to me, and he was sounding out words, and I found it fascinating because he came across the word about. So he sounded it out, and he said, a, b, o, u, t, a boot, a boot. And I instantly corrected him and said, about. But what's really fascinating about that is actually that sounded like the pronunciation in some Scottish accents and some Canadian accents. So at some point, potentially, people were trying to pronounce it more phonetically and therefore came up with the pronunciation a boot, which is exactly what my son did while reading the word and sounding it out as in phonics. Now, one thing in phonics that they say is that a double O can be pronounced oo, which is fine when you go to a word like school or cool, but not in a word like look, which still has those two O's, but it is a short vowel sound. That's a thing to remember as well. We'll talk about some top tips. So he read the word book, and he said b-oo-k, book, book. And I said, no, it's book. However, that pronunciation does exist because some speakers from Liverpool will say book rather than book, which is actually fascinating and bleeds into the idea of what is really the correct pronunciation. But for me, in a modern British RP accent, it's about and book. But my son has even more to play in this story because one of his friends has moved to another school, and the school's name is Honeyhill. And this is where things get really interesting because he wanted to search on YouTube for a video to see where his friend was moving. And he asked me, how do I spell Honeyhill? Now, this school is spelt Hunnyhill. Honey Hill. But I said to him, sound it out and write it yourself. So he started off strong. He said, H. Fine. Then he got to the first vowel. So he wrote the letter U, which actually makes more sense in this word than it does in the word honey, which is spelled Honey. Then he got to N, and he wrote the letter N. Hun. Fine. But what he didn't realise is there's two N's in there. So I had to kind of correct him and say there's two N's. And he said, why? And I had to say, because that's how it's spelt. And then he got to the final sound of the first part. And he said E. And he wrote the letter E. And I said, nope, it's not that. So he wrote the letter I. And I said, nope, it's not that. And he wrote the letter Y. He was struggling, but he got there in the end. And then he moved on to hill. He wrote H, I, and a W. Honeyhill. Honeyhill with a W sound at the end. And why is this really interesting? Well, some accents out there, in fact, speakers of estuary English, some of them will pronounce the dark L as a W sound. So instead of saying milk, they'll say milk, milk. And he was representing that. So over the course of reading, he managed to pronounce one word like a Canadian, one word like a Liverpudlian, and one word like somebody who speaks estuary English. And I found it absolutely fascinating. But it goes to show that you can never trust the spelling in English and that you need to realize that English is not a phonetic language. We have 44 sounds, but only 26 letters. There is a lot to say on this subject, but this lesson would go on forever if I talked about that now. But effectively, we don't have enough letters for the sounds. If you want to correct English, try. Many people have tried to add a new alphabet, but so far, we're stuck with the madness that we've got. So what can you do about it? Well, let's give you some top tips. First of all, remember, you can never trust the spelling in English. Focus instead in learning the sounds. Now, I teach a course called the Ultimate British Pronunciation Guide, which teaches you the sounds of English. This is what you need to focus on first. Remember that it's more about learning the sounds. Once you see how a word is written and you hear how it's pronounced, you can start to get an idea. Sadly, a lot of words in English, it's about memorizing the writing and memorizing the pronunciation. The second tip is remember that a lot of words have silent letters. Sometimes they have no linguistic reason other than some scholars in the 1600s who thought it would be quite chic to add a B to det. So try to remember silent letters. There are some rules out there that will help you to understand when a B is silent, for example. But the best thing to do is try and learn some rules related to silent letters and also remember some common words like knife that has a silent K. The third tip to remember, gemination does exist sometimes, but just because you've got two vowels doesn't make it a long vowel sound, and just because you've got two consonant sounds doesn't make it a longer consonant sound. And the final tip is forgive yourself. Absolutely forgive yourself. English spelling is madness, as we've seen from that massive long history that spans 1,000 years. 1,000 years of chaos, and if you misspell a word, forgive yourself, because a lot of English speakers do as well. Remember, there is a PDF down below where you can learn far more about this lesson. You can download that in the link below. But let's answer this question. Is English spelling weird? Absolutely. But it's not random. There is a reason for the chaos. It is a language that has been pulled in a dozen different directions for over 1,000 years. And the result is kind of a beautiful, chaotic tapestry. Every time you struggle with a word, you're not failing a test. You're actually encountering a piece of history. Forgive yourself and love the process. English spelling is a reflection of its history. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson, and please do give it a like and let me know anything else you'd like to watch. See you next time.